Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am grateful that it is Friday. It's been a very hard week. Let's leave it at that for right now, because that could take up an entire podcast on its own, and I have an author interview to bring to you, as I mentioned on the end of the last episode. In today's episode, I'm speaking with author David Puretz about his debut novel. Tuesday's episode was about a debut novel. This one is called The Escapist. Again, the author is David Puretz, and the description. It's 2011 in America. The Iraq War is coming to a close, and the Occupy Wall Street movement has been gaining steam. And at 21 years of age, Billy Chute is sitting in the breakdown lane on the side of the highway in his 98 Altima with his drugs in a cooler on the passenger seat floor, in the midst of escaping yet another stale reality. Still high on an opioid and amphetamine kick, his new escape crystallizes into a journal entry: "Find Dad." And those few simple words seal Billy's fate. What started as another of his impulsive flights becomes a mission, and it terrifies him, for his father is like wildfire, burning all in its path. Yet confronting his traumatic past may be Billy's only sustainable way forward. A propulsive story with profound insights about freedom and imprisonment, motion and stasis, chance and destiny, The Escapist delves deeply into the internal and external calamities that shape this special human life and mind. Mental health, family conflict and abuse, drug addiction and sexuality are intricately woven together in a turbulent pre-Trump America in this dynamic and layered narrative of violence and hope. So, as you may gather from that description of The Escapist, this isn't exactly light-hearted reading. This book deals with a lot of deep and sometimes troubling subjects, but it really is a look at all of the factors that go into making someone who they are, and those factors can be generational. In this book, Billy is the main character, and he has had a lot of different things happen to him in his life. We meet him when he is an early adult in his 20s. He is often high, and he is often escaping the world around him, hence the name The Escapist. This quest then to find his father, who disappeared from his life but who has left an indelible mark on that life, really leads him on a journey to discovering a lot of different things about himself, about his family. Those things are not always easy. It's an interesting time period. It's only 9 years ago, but it feels, in some ways it feels like a million years ago, with the Iraq War coming to a close, Occupy Wall Street movement happening. In some ways it feels kind of similar to what's going on now, but it gives you a slightly different perspective on a time not so long ago, and so you can see some similarities and some comparisons, but it gives you a different lens on the world and into this book. So, and of course then this different perspective, this historical backdrop, gives the specific time frame, specific lens through which we view Billy's journey, and it influences how he reacts and where that journey takes him. So let's go ahead now and turn to the interview with David so he can explain more about why he wrote this story, what he hopes you'll take away from the story, all of those wonderful author-y kinds of questions and conversations. So again, the book is The Escapist. It is written by David Puretz, and let's turn now to that interview. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We are here to talk about your debut novel, The Escapist. Before we get to the novel, though, if you could share a bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So, The Escapist is my debut novel, and I had been working on it for a very long time, so I'm very excited that it's now out in the world. Not as excited that it came out right before this pandemic hit, so that kind of hurt the promotional side of things. But I'm so happy to be here to talk about it. I teach writing at Yeshiva University, and I also work for a small literary journal called Global City Review. And I have an MFA in creative writing from the City College of New York. And I was living in New York City, but for the last couple of months, I've been at my little cabin about an hour and 45 minutes north of New York City.
That sounds lovely, actually. Now, when you say little cabin, is it like a one-room cabin? Is it what are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's a two-bedroom cabin, and it's in Sullivan County, New York. And it's we have a lake, a small lake called Wolf Lake. That's it's not too far from here. I can see it through my window as we speak. And we got the cabin in November, and it was just really good timing. So when the pandemic hit, we my wife and I both have been able to work from home. I've been teaching online. And so we just left New York City and we came to the cabin. Now it's a major fixer-upper, so we had plans to spend a couple years fixing it up, but here we are. So we're in the middle of having the septic system replaced, and a number of other things like a pretty nasty carpenter ant infestation. But that's what comes with cabin living, I guess.
It's really interesting because the author that I just interviewed before you, I had 2 interviews this weekend, and her main character has a little cabin that's a fixer-upper, and it's in New Hampshire, but it's on a pond. And so while you're talking, I keep kind of getting it mixed up with the book that I just read from Christine. It's very
That's
interesting.
true.
And his name is also David. So
Wow.
I feel like you're maybe embodying this character that I just read a book about.
What's the book?
The book is called The Way You Burn. It's also her debut novel. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
And that actually fits my book too, because there's a major fire burn theme.
Yes.
Specifically toward the second half of the book.
There was a lot of crossover and interesting coincidences in reading for these 2 interviews this weekend. That was kind of fun. So.
Very cool.
So let's go ahead and talk about your book. Again, it's called The Escapist. Can you give an overview of the story?
Yeah, sure. So it's about a young man. His name is Billy Chute. And he has always been an escapist. He's always needed to escape his reality. And he comes from a troubled, broken home, a very abusive father. His mother died when he was a baby. And he has always resorted to just escaping, sometimes in the form of mentally escaping, other times actually physically running away from where he is. So his father and his brother are both serve in the military, and he comes from a long line of military servicemen. he himself decided not to enlist. And so it takes place in the late about 2011 or so, so it's right at the end of the Iraq War, right when the Occupy Wall Street movement is gaining steam, and Billy's father returns from war, and he himself, after having returned, escaped. He ran away, kind of left home in the middle of the night, and just kind of disappeared. And so there was a kind of role reversal taking place, and Billy decided to track him down to find Dad. And those were the first two words of the book: find Dad.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast, but now you have a bit more of an overview of David's inspiration for the book and the story and the character of Billy. So, as I said, we're going to take that first break, and when we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the complexity of the story, the different layers of the story. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author David Puretz about his debut novel, The Escapist. Let's go ahead and get back to the interview with David. So there are a lot of different layers throughout this book. I mean, Billy's life is certainly not... It's very complicated. Let's just go with that. And, some of that is from his own creation, and some of that is just everything that's happened to him in his life and his family. And you don't shy away from some pretty difficult topics in the book. What about Billy as the main character do you think may or may not resonate with readers?
Yeah. Well, in a lot of ways, it's a story about trauma and dealing with trauma and finding a way to recover from that trauma. And a lot of characters in this book, not just Billy, are suffering from their own form of trauma. It's very clear that not only has his father suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome from war, but he also had a pretty difficult life, difficult relationship with his own father. And so these things can pass down. So it's also about the idea of the legacy of trauma. And so I wanted to paint a picture for readers of what it's like to be so deeply embedded in that kind of life. Luckily for me, I had a very good childhood. I have fabulous parents. So I really had to do a lot of research, a lot of digging to really understand what this experience is and to capture it truthfully. So I wanted that raw honesty, and a lot of the feedback I've gotten is that people appreciate that look into trauma and the honesty about what it is to go through this kind of trauma. So it's a pretty raw look at someone in the midst of dealing with these traumatic experiences of the past.
And what was your initial inspiration then for the story?
So originally, I wanted to write a story about a writer. I've always been really interested in stories about writers, self-reflexive fiction, metafiction, meta-narration. I was always really drawn to that kind of writing. And I was just obsessed with writers when I was younger because I wanted to be a writer. And so I knew early on that I wanted to write a story about a writer. And it became a story about someone who turns to writing and uses writing in order to help them heal. And that's what happens with Billy. Half the story is third-person narration, and half of it is Billy's first-person journal entries, where we see his writing and how he uses writing in order to cope.
Can you talk about what a frame narrative is and why you were drawn to this style for this novel?
Sure. So, a frame story. This type of writing is used often, where you get a taste of both the protagonist's firsthand perspective alongside the more traditional third-person narration, and so I think it was important to show both, because Billy is this escapist, because he struggles with drugs, makes him somewhat of a unreliable narrator, and so we have that balanced with the third person that coincides, that works alongside with that first person journal entry. So we really get to see where Billy is being truthful and when he's not being truthful, and so we get a better understanding of Billy's plight. So it's a way of really getting a deep three-dimensional look at a character. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to use it. And I think it was particularly important if you're writing about a writer, then we need to see both sides.
The book is set in 2011, which you did mention. What made you decide then to set it in this year specifically, as opposed to maybe a more current setting?
Yeah, it was an important time for me personally. I was 20 years old on 9/11, so it made sense to place Billy, who was around the same age at the time, in that same era. I also, because it's a story about a military family, I thought the Iraq War, specifically the time period during the Iraq War troop surge. I don't know if you remember that, when Bush did this surge of troops and pushed them into Iraq, and it was a big thing. Mm-hmm. And so that was an important moment. And then the Occupy Wall Street movement as well. And so I was around Billy's age when all of this was happening. And so I felt like it was an important time period to capture this particular experience that Billy is having. It was also a time period that it preceded the opioid crisis, and there were still a lot of people who were struggling with heroin and opioids, yet it wasn't such a discussed or open problem as it has become. So it was a prelude to that. So I thought it was really important to capture that time period as well. Billy wasn't the victim when that major influx of drugs into the country was really taking root, and so it was also important to show that time period for that reason as well. But politically as well, I wanted to show a time period that came right before the one we're in now. So as the pre-Trump era, and all of these different factors that brought us to where we are now.
and it's interesting too because it's not that long ago. It's less than a decade ago. But part of Billy's struggles with drug abuse did come from his childhood, and there's some mentions of his father and stepmother just kind of giving him everything for Ritalin and everything for ADHD and those types of things, which I feel like we've come a little ways in understanding more now. But back then, it was just kind of medicate.
That's right.
And clearly that had an effect on how he grew up and what choices he made later on. That is a difficult subject, and as I said, there are other difficult subjects throughout the story. So what do you hope that readers might take away from their reading of this book?
Yeah, I want to give readers just an intimate look into this writer's lived experiences that inspire the words that they set down on the page, and we get to see those words as well. So I want them to see this young man's journey as he begins a life of writing, and it's born out of this journey to find his father, this Iraq War vet. So I wanted to give readers dual narratives that complement each other, and just provide a look into this complicated study, and something that I feel like a lot of other more traditional novels don't do. They don't really get too cerebral, where I felt it was really important to get a little bit deeper into the mindset, because he is a writer, because he is struggling with trauma. I really wanted to capture what was happening inside, and I wanted readers to see that as well. And I wanted readers to understand that that writing, the act of writing, the act of storytelling, can have incredible healing powers. It has an incredible way of letting us cope with difficult situations.
It is time to go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about the different types of research that David did in writing this novel. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author David Puretz. So then what kinds of research did you do for the book?
So in 2008, my wife and I, she was my girlfriend at the time, we traveled the country. For about 3 months, we traveled all over in our old Subaru Forester. I think we hit about 43 states or so, and we spent a lot of time specifically moving along the eastern seaboard. And so I didn't know it at the time, but that really was part of the research, that at least as far as the geography is concerned for the story, as Billy's plight takes him along the eastern seaboard as well, from New York to Maryland, through Virginia to Florida, and back through the Appalachian Trail, and then back to New York again. So geographically speaking, that was a big component to the research. But then beyond the geography portion of it, I really had to do a lot of research into addiction, a lot of research into drugs, a lot of research into trauma, and a lot of research into father-son relationships that have a sexual component to them, because there is this underlying it's something that Billy struggles to understand and deal with through the whole entire novel. But as readers maybe I'm giving too much away here, but as readers continue to read, they'll see that there was some level of sexual abuse as well. So I had to look into that type of father-son relationship as well. And it's rare, but it does occur. It does happen.
Yes. So then in terms, you mentioned the road trip and that kind of research. Are there any, after what you just talked about, this is an awkward question, but are there autobiographical elements anywhere in the book? Maybe not in terms of Billy's act experiences, but are there locations or things that you used from your own experience?
Yeah. I get this question a lot because, people who know me, they read the story about this guy and they're like, what happened to you? But no, Billy's life is very, very different from my own. I saw this great line. I can't remember who said it, but it was that someone asked the author how much of their story was autobiographical, and she said, all of it and none of it. And I like that. I like that way of framing it because, Billy is a product of my own imagination, which makes him part of me in a way. But at the same time, his actual real experiences are so far removed from what I experienced. But, I'm a writer. He becomes a writer. There are some crossover elements there. And so I think in the very, very beginning, when I first started writing this story, Billy was probably a little bit closer to who I am. But as his character developed, he really became a separate person, and I had to let that person take the wheel, and I had to trust in that character's world, in his experiences, and I had to focus in on that and develop that. So does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Because I think often when we read books, we can easily kind of conflate the main characters with the author and wonder, geez, how much of this is real or whatever. So
absolutely, it was a big fear for me, actually, because because this character has so much going on, because he's a drug addict, because he was sexually abused by his father, people to think that there was something going on with my own relationship with my own father, and for the sake of my father, who's a fabulous, fantastic human being, I didn't want people to get the wrong idea. So I it was a fear, but it was an important story, and I needed to honor the story, and I needed to honor the characters. But I include a note at the end where I basically make it clear that, my father and my parents are wonderful human beings, and that people should not confuse Alan Chute with my father, because they're so far from each other. But that's one of the things with writing fiction, is that people often do tend to connect either the characters or the storylines with the authors themselves. And in some cases, it is much closer to their lived experiences, and in other cases, it's very far removed from it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that we sometimes feel like we maybe know the author a little bit after we read a book, and that's not always the case. I mean, you get so invested in the story, and it sometimes it's hard to remember. Oh, this is fiction, right? I'm not reading a memoir.
Yeah.
Are you working on anything now in terms of another novel or other types of writing?
Yeah, so this novel came out at the start of my semester, and now my semester has just ended. I actually have to submit grades by tomorrow, and so my teaching has really taken up a lot of my time. So I haven't delved into the next project yet so deeply, but I have a pretty good idea of where I want to go, and I plan on spending a lot of time this summer working on it. But yeah, it's been very busy and very crazy these last couple months, as you know, and so I haven't had any time to write. So once the semester ends, I'll be able to spend a little bit more time getting into it.
Sounds good. You said that you've always kind of known that you wanted to be a writer. So, did you know you wanted to write novels? Did you just know that you wanted to write? How did that look for you?
I always really loved writing. I think I really fell hard for it when I was in college, and I majored in writing as an undergraduate. And it was at that time that I really developed a love for self-reflexive fiction. And Paul Auster's New York trilogy, which is an incredible book, that was a game changer for me. And I just loved what he was able to do on the page. So I really obsessed over Paul Auster for a long time, and I read everything he wrote. And he may be the reason I decided to become a writer. His early stuff is amazing. His more recent stuff, I don't know. He's lost something. I think he's lost his edge to some degree. But he was a big influence on me wanting to become a writer. So I ate up all of his stuff, cut my teeth on it. J.M. Coetzee, Disgrace, Murakami, and Vonnegut. I couldn't get enough of these stories, these stories within stories, and I really wanted to try my hand at it, and I haven't looked back since.
Okay, final break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll be talking about David's experiences teaching writing and more. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author David Puretz about his debut novel, The Escapist. And you also teach writing. So do you find that your writing influences your teaching or your teaching influences your writing?
Both. my students teach me so much every day, and I learn a lot just from it. I've got the best job in the world. I get to talk about the thing that I love the most for a living, and so certain components to writing that I really appreciate, I'll bring into the classroom, and students will take that and it'll teach me so much, and then I'll be able to use that and then adapt way of thinking for my own writing, and vice versa. I'll take something that they think they know about writing, and I'll try to turn it on its head. And so a lot of my teaching in college is to freshmen. Most students, when they enter university, have to take a first-year writing class. Sometimes it's called freshman composition or first-year seminar. It has different names, but almost at most universities across the United States, it's mandatory for them to take this first-year writing class, and that's what I teach. That's my bread and butter. And so the majority of my students are not going to become writers, yet I'm able to show them the power of writing and the power of language, and then they're able to show me too different ways of wielding that sword, which is fabulous. And it's a great thing about being a teacher, is that you're always learning as a teacher.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that's really a fabulous way to look at it. Not that you're just, I'm going to dump all this information into your brain and you can go from there, but really that it's a back and forth and almost a dialogue.
Absolutely. And it should be, especially for writing class.
Yeah. When you take the time then to read for yourself, who are your favorite authors or genres?
So as I said, Paul Auster was always a big influence, and I guess I can go as far as saying that he's my favorite writer still. But more recently, I read a lot of different types of books, mostly literary fiction, and because that's what I read, that's what I'm interested in. So I'll read writers that are of that ilk, and so actually something a little bit more thriller-esque, and it's called Dark Matter, which is a fascinating, really interesting book. And have you heard of it?
I don't think so.
But Blake Crouch, Dark Matter, really fun, fast read, and so I've just kind of been working through it, and it's a really cool, fun book. I also just read this book called Black Card by my friend Chris Terry, which is a really interesting story. It's about a guy who's half black and half white, and trying to navigate that life, and it's about this guy that basically is black card and says you have to honor the black life, but if you end up moving away from that, your black card gets revoked. Kind of an interesting premise for a story, and so that's what I'm reading now. But again, the big ones that really had an influence, I'd say, again, Paul Auster, J.M. Coetzee, Murakami, Vonnegut, Barth, Pinter, Borges. Those are the ones that really had an influence on me, that would send me down these rabbit holes as a reader. And then it's fun just trying to find your way back out. So the more kind of cerebral stories are the ones I was always drawn to, excuse me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, from your writing experience, your teaching experience, even your reading experience, advice for aspiring authors?
Yeah. Writing, it's a difficult game, and it's a game that you're not going to make a lot of money in unless you're really, really lucky, and of course, really, really talented. And so, with that in mind, why would anyone want to do this in the first place? And I think it's because you feel like you have to do it, and you get enjoyment out of the process. So I would say, if you don't enjoy the process, I don't know if it's necessarily worth it. You have to enjoy those steps that go into the finished product. That's the most exciting and enthralling part about it. And so, so my advice would be, as you're developing your story, just know that this is the best part of it. That when it's done and when it's published, though you think that's the grand finale, it's not. At this point, I have realized that the best part of writing this book was the actual process, and not what's come afterward. It's been the craft that's been the most exciting part. So I guess it would just be enjoy the crafting, and let that lead you as you write in terms of your contentment.
All right, thank you for that. I
Does that
know
make
you have. Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I know you have a website, so if you can share your website as well as where people might be able to interact with you on social media.
Yeah, sure. So the website is davidpuretz.com. The last name is spelled Puretz, and the website for the press is globalcitypress.com. And you can buy the book there or anywhere else where books are sold.
All right, thank you. And also, thank you so much for joining me. We've talked a lot about different topics today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping to talk about in terms of the book or writing? Anything at all that you would like to bring up at this point?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I guess I'll end with a little anecdote. I was talking with someone who emailed me, and they said that they started reading the book. They got to about the second chapter, and they said they had to stop reading because it was too painful. It was too close to home for him, because he himself had a traumatic childhood and a difficult relationship with his father, and particularly with his brother. And his brother in the story, and Billy's brother, is also a pretty important character in the story. And so he emailed me, and he said he had to stop reading because it was just too close to home. But then he wrote a little story, a true story about his own experience when he was a kid. And through that, and through the writing of it, I think he himself was able to start finding some level of healing by writing about his own experience and by writing about his own trauma. And just because of that, I feel like the book succeeded. Even though he wasn't even able to finish it, I feel like the book succeeded because the main purpose was that he understood that writing has such healing powers, that he understood that, and then he used that, and then he himself wrote me this story about his own experience. And it was just a really interesting, powerful email to receive.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I'm so glad that he was able to take the experience and it was obviously a trigger for him, but that he was able to use that for something creative and hopefully helpful.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, David, I want to thank you once again for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. Again, the book is called The Escapist, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. Really nice chatting with you.
Thank you once again to David for joining me to talk about his debut novel, The Escapist. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do go ahead and give us a nice review, whether that's 5-star or written. Either way, it really helps to get this podcast out to other people who love books as much as we do. If you are not already following us on social media, please do that too. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Of course, GSMC Book Review is all you have to type in and you'll find us. I would love to hear your thoughts, your comments, and especially what you're reading right now. I love to hear what people are reading right now. And actually, I'm always talking about my to-be-read list. A friend of mine posted on Facebook this week a list of 1,000 books you may actually have read. And I think I hit, what was my number? I had read 196 of the 1,000. And my brother had read like 125. My mom had read about 235. And these were still way above average for the number of books that most people have read. But there are a lot of books on that list that are on my to-be-read list, and then there were more books that I was like, oh man, that should be on my to-be-read list. There were a few books that I had finally read, so I could check those off, but I had read them way later than I thought that I should. But I don't know. The TBR list for me is just a never-ending work in progress. It will never be done. It will always be huge. It will always be unwieldy. And yet I'm still not going to stop asking people what they're reading or looking at lists like this, et cetera, et cetera. So, my whole point was tell me what you're reading. Follow us on social media and tell me what you're reading so that you can contribute to the unwieldiness of my to-be-read list. Thanks so much. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope that you will join me for Tuesday's episode when I will be speaking with author Robert J. Sawyer about his book, The Oppenheimer Alternative. It is historical fiction, and it's a really fascinating look at the members of the Manhattan Project and how a lot of that played out. So it's definitely a good learning experience if you don't know a lot about the Manhattan Project, and it's another book that's that gives you good information and in this case history, but without feeling like it's a really dry textbook. So please join me again on Tuesday for that interview. As I said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Please stay safe. The world is crazy right now. Whatever you're doing to be a part of that world, please do stay safe. And if you have the time and can stay home, I hope there's plenty of opportunity for you to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.